That winter, Eric and a group of fellow prisoners decided to build a secret radio in their POW camp. They had carried bits of radios from Changi, broken down and scattered among several men. Sergeant Major Lance Thu became their radio maker. He finished the set one night, crawling under his blanket with headphones on, and emerged smiling with scribbled notes. He had heard the crisp voice of a BBC announcer. The radio was primitive, about 9 inches long, hidden in a coffee tin with a false top filled with ground nuts. It sat innocently by Thu's bed, but Eric's story begins in 1919 in the grey stone city of Edinburgh. In 1919, a boy named Eric Lomax was born in Edinburgh, a city of grey stone and rattling trams. His earliest memory was not of a pet or a park, but of a strange mechanical assembly, a wall of maroon and white cable trams blocking the road at Joppa, their open platforms and wooden frames like moving houses. His father, a post office manager and a child of the industrial age, took him to see the oily cable pit where a steel hawser pulled the cars through the streets. But it was his mother, a gentle woman from the Shetland Islands, who filled his head with stories of lonely crofts and the endless sound of the sea. One autumn evening in 1932, Eric stopped on a footbridge and looked down into Portobello Goods Yard. The sight of working steam engines, their polished brass, the crash of couplings, the smell of coal smoke unlocked a passion that would never leave him. School became a penance, so at 16 Eric did what his father expected. He left and joined the post office as a sorting clerk. He spent his days opening parcels and sorting football pools mail, but his evenings were given to telegraphy classes. A chance conversation on a railway platform drew him into the Charlotte Baptist Chapel, a fundamentalist sect that offered fellowship and certainty. There he met a young woman and became engaged, though he barely knew her. His spare time was still given to trains. He mapped obscure branch lines, cycled hundreds of miles to photograph locomotives, and wrote an article for a railway magazine. The world was sliding toward war, but Eric kept his eyes on the rails. By the spring of 1941, Eric was a signalman in the Royal Corps of Signals, training in Scarborough. One evening, German bombers came over the town, and a magnesium incendiary bomb crashed through the ceiling of the house where he sat with his parents. It fizzled on the carpet, throwing off fierce heat. Eric grabbed a shovel, scooped up the burning cylinder, and ran outside. The bomb burned through the steel blade and fell at his feet, but the house was saved. Soon after, he volunteered for overseas service. His parents came to see him off in the dark streets of Scarborough. His mother stood distraught in the crowd. He never saw her again. In March 1941, Eric Lomax boarded the luxury liner Strathmore at Greenock on the Clyde, part of a great convoy carrying troops to a secret destination. The ship sailed south through the Atlantic, past the coast of Africa, and put in at Freetown before reaching Cape Town. While his comrades celebrated their shore leave with drinks and generous hospitality, Eric wandered off alone through the station. He found an ancient locomotive on a plinth, a small tank engine built in Leith in 1859, the first engine ever to work in the Cape Colony. He stood there for a long time, admiring the fragile, ungainly wheels and delicate coupling rods, his passion for steam engines still alive even as the world burned. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. The convoy reached Bombay after 6 weeks at sea, and the shock of India overwhelmed him. The dry heat, the crowds, the poverty spread across every street. He was ordered north by train, nearly 1,400 miles to Rawalpindi, near the foothills of the Himalayas, riding the flagship of the railway system, the Frontier Mail. He settled into the routines of Indian Army life, lecturing on radio practice while also learning to ride a horse, for the old army still moved by cavalry and mule trains. The regiment was being built up for what the officers called tropical service, and in October they loaded their guns and vehicles onto special trains and headed back to Bombay Harbor. On November 6, the green hills and jungle of Malaya appeared to starboard, and the Orion docked at Keppel Harbor in Singapore to the sound of a brass band playing "There'll Always Be an England." A dignitary pointed out Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the man in charge of the fortress, and Eric felt the proud weight of belonging to a great imperial army. He was posted east to Kuantan on the coast of Malaya, where he lived in a canvas tent among coconut palms and rubber trees. The fine rain was warm and almost soothing as he set up his radios and switchboards, waiting for an assault that everyone knew was coming. On the morning of December 8th, a messenger woke Eric with the highest priority signal. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, bombed Singapore, and stormed ashore at Kota Baru, 200 miles north of his position. The scramble was immediate, with messengers and radio signals going out to all gun positions, but the war seemed a long way from this deceptively peaceful camp. Then the sky filled with twin-engined bombers, 3 neat waves of 9 each, with rising sun emblems on their wings. So close he could see the black specks of the bombs falling. He watched them walk their explosives across the airfield with calm, methodical precision, and the sound of cannon fire from the Sikh troops below mixed with the drone of the engines. The great twin-engine Japanese bombers passed overhead as though they owned the sky, and within hours the airfield was abandoned by its own defenders, the RAF gone without warning or explanation. The next day, Eric walked down to the beach beneath the coconut palms and stood alone on the clean white sand, the warm green sea lapping at the shore. A deep, distant rumbling came from over the horizon, like thunder but not thunder, lasting nearly an hour. He had heard the British Empire fall out at sea just beyond the curve of the earth. The battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were being swarmed by Japanese torpedo bombers with no air cover at all. Both ships sank in a couple of hours off Kuantan, taking with them the myth of naval invincibility and any real hope of holding Malaya. The young signalman stood on the beach, hearing the huge cracks of the explosions as fellow radio men trapped at their posts under the bridges of the great ships died in the warm water. 2 weeks later, the order came to withdraw across the Kuantan River, and the ferry became a nightmare bottleneck, a mile of vehicles waiting to cross on 2 rusting barges winched along a cable. In the chaos of the retreat, Eric discovered that a 3-man radio section was missing from his unit. He and a sergeant named Watson crossed back over the river on motorbikes in the dark without lights, driving through abandoned rubber plantations, hoping not to meet a Japanese patrol. They found no one, and the enemy was closing in, so they roared back to the ferry and were pulled across just as the first Japanese soldiers reached the far bank. The missing section reappeared hours later, having assembled at the wrong place, but by then Eric had already learned the cold arithmetic of a fighting retreat. The regiment fell back all the way down the peninsula, through crowds of frightened villagers driven south by the Japanese, past abandoned vehicles and the wreckage of a defeated army. Eric reached Singapore a week before the causeway linking it to Malaya was blown up, and he was sent into the battle box at Fort Canning, General Percival's underground headquarters. For 3 weeks he barely saw daylight, working 18-hour days on the radios and phones, sleeping on the concrete floor among coils of cable and exhausted signalmen. The messages grew worse every day. The Japanese had taken the reservoirs and turned off the taps. The big ships were leaving Keppel Harbor with civilians, troops were deserting, and no one could give sensible orders anymore. On Sunday, February 15, 1942, another officer told Eric that Percival was about to surrender. A dead silence enveloped the old fort, and the men collapsed on mattresses laid over cables and landlines, depression flooding in as the spring of tension that had kept them going for weeks finally snapped. Eric slept for 10 hours, and in the morning he stepped outside to see 4 cars moving slowly up the hill with small rising sun pennants fluttering on their wings. Japanese officers stepped out, long swords and black scabbards hanging from dark green uniforms, the first Japanese soldiers Eric had ever seen. They strode confidently into the fort, and the young signalman understood that these people now ruled this part of the world and that he was their prisoner. The long columns stretched for more than half a mile. Converging from side roads onto the main route, a dense mass of jostling, overloaded men trying to keep their dignity. A defeated army is a strange thing. The awesome killing machine was suddenly obeying orders from an enemy so sparse that there seemed to be only a couple of dozen guards at the prison camp. The purpose of their collective existence was snuffed out. Annoying, permanent uncertainty took its place. This uncertainty would become the dominant feature of every remaining day of captivity. Eric Lomax entered Changi prison camp with nothing but his life and whatever stubbornness his upbringing had given him, and that would have to be enough. By the summer of 1942, the defeated army at Changi had settled into an uneasy routine. Then the Japanese commander, General Fukuye Shimpei, issued a new order. Every prisoner must sign a non-escape form. Only 4 men signed. To make his point, Fukuye had 4 prisoners shot on the beach near Changi, tied to posts and executed by a firing squad of the Indian National Army. The British soldiers were killed by their former subjects. The same afternoon, The Japanese ordered every prisoner to move to Selarang Barracks, a space built for 800 men. 16,000 prisoners were crammed into that small area, filling every inch of the parade ground, the balconies, and the stairwells. Latrines overflowed. The smell of human waste hung over the barracks like a fog. On the second night, the Australians organized a concert, and 16,000 voices sang Land of Hope and Glory into the darkness. After 3 days, the situation became intolerable. The Japanese announced they would move all sick patients from the hospital into the barracks, guaranteeing epidemics. Colonel Holmes, the senior British officer, ordered the men to sign. They lined up and did it. The prisoners walked back to their quarters at Changi. Selarang had been a watershed, a twist in the spiral of cruelty. Nothing was quite the same again in October. Eric Lomax was ordered into a covered goods van with 25 other men and sent north. The train rumbled up the west coast of Malaya, through vivid green fields and miles of rubber plantations. At Banpong Station, they disembarked stiff and filthy. This was the closest point on the Siamese railway system to the coast of southern Burma, more than 200 miles away over the mountains. The village had become a boom town, crowded with camps and hutments, its station jammed with trains. Eric was sent to a workshop camp at Kanburi, about 30 miles northwest of Banpong. The camp was a series of bamboo huts thatched with a tap, with a not very convincing bamboo fence around the perimeter. Here he would help repair locomotives and equipment for the new railway the Japanese were building across the mountains into Burma. The work was skilled, and for now the Japanese engineers left them alone. Eric took on the job of camp carpenter and signwriter and learned to become a competent thief of Japanese tools and materials. Outside the workshop, the reality of the railway was different. Eric walked out one day and came to a place where a gap had been torn out of a hill. Hundreds of half-naked men were passing earth in baskets, clearing bamboo clumps with saws and axes, chopping out tropical hardwoods with blunt implements. There was scarcely a piece of machinery among them. The flat-bottomed steel rails weighed 70 pounds per yard, and one rail followed another relentlessly. Rest periods were rare, and any slackening was met with abuse or violence. That winter, Eric and a group of fellow prisoners decided to build a secret radio. They had carried bits of radios from Changi, broken down and scattered among several men so that each had only a tiny piece. Sergeant Major Lance Thew of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps became their radio maker. He was joined by Fred Smith, a sergeant in the Royal Artillery and another gifted mechanic. They scrounged valves from local traders, worked out the optimum length for an aerial, and set up a security system in their hut. Thew finished the set one night, crawling under his blanket with the headphones on. He emerged smiling, with scribbled notes. He had heard the crisp voice of a BBC announcer cutting through the static. The radio was primitive, little more than a crystal set tuned to a single frequency, about 9 inches long by 4 inches wide. It fit into a coffee tin with a false top, filled with ground nuts. There it sat innocently by Thew's bed, a rusty silver can hiding the valves and condensers. Every evening the routine was the same. Prisoners stood guard while Thew burrowed under his blanket, tuned the set, and listened to the 10-minute news bulletin. He noted down the main items with a pencil. The precious scrap of paper was handed around a small group afterwards. They heard about the victories in the Solomon Islands, at Guadalcanal and New Guinea, and that the Germans had been stopped in Russia. For the first time since the surrender, they felt that they might eventually be liberated. On the morning of August 29, 1943, the Japanese kept every prisoner standing at attention in the assembly area. It was still half dark. A group of guards walked into the huts, and soon a crescendo of pulling and clattering began. After 3 hours, Thew was called. They had found the radio. A guard had spotted a small triangle of white paper in Thew's folded blanket, pulled it, and uncovered a pair of headphones. In the ransacking, they found 4 wireless sets in various stages of completion. 3 weeks later, on the night of September 21st, Eric and 4 other officers, Major Bill Smith, Major Jim Slater, Major Harry Knight, and Lieutenant Morton Mackay, were taken to Kanburi Aerodrome Camp. They were forced to stand to attention in front of the guard room. After midnight, a group of drunk Japanese NCOs approached with pickaxe handles. Major Bill Smith was called out first and beaten down, then Morton Mackay, then Eric. He took off his spectacles and watch, laid them carefully on the table behind him, and stood to attention. The blows came down on his back, his hips, his arms. He heard his own bones snap and felt his teeth break. He was thrown into a ditch of foul water and lost consciousness. The next morning, a stretcher party carried the 5 men to the camp hospital. A Dutch doctor counted the damage. Both of Eric's forearms were broken, several ribs cracked, one hip damaged, and his back was a single blue-black bruise from his shoulders to his knees. Captain Jack Hawley and Lieutenant Stanley Armitage were not so lucky. Their broken bodies were carried away and dropped down a deep latrine in the Japanese section of the camp. The Dutch doctor had counted 900 strokes of the pick helves before the beating ended just before dawn. 2 weeks after the beating, in the early hours of October 7, 1943, a squad of Kempeitai arrived at the Canberra hospital. These were not ordinary army guards. Their reputation among prisoners was absolute terror. They pulled Eric Lomax and the other surviving officers from their cots and loaded them onto a truck. No one explained where they were going. The truck stopped at a merchant's building in Canberra town, near the Mae Klong River. Inside the courtyard stood a row of tiny cages made of bamboo lattice. Each cell measured 5 feet long, less than 3 feet wide, and under 5 feet high. The guards shoved Eric into one of them. He could not stand upright and had to lie diagonally on the dirt floor to fit his 6-foot frame. They took his shoes and left him with one blanket and a tin cup. The heat inside the cage became unbearable by midday. The sun baked the flat roof until the cell turned into an oven. Giant red ants crawled over Eric's body, and his broken arms and their wooden splints made it impossible to brush them away. The guards fed him 2 small balls of heavily salted rice each day. The salt made him desperately thirsty, but they gave him almost no water. He could not communicate with the other prisoners in their cages nearby. A sentry with a fixed bayonet paced the yard after a full day and night of this isolation. The guards pulled Eric from his cage and brought him inside the main building. Across a narrow table of dark hardwood sat 2 Japanese men. One was a large shaven-headed NCO with a thick neck and a face full of violence. The other was smaller, delicate, with black hair and a wide mouth. He spoke English with a heavy accent. He introduced himself as the interpreter for the special police investigation into anti-Japanese activities. The interrogation began with Eric's family history, then moved to his education, his pre-war job, his war record. The questions circled back again and again to the radios. Then the interpreter placed something on the table and spread it flat. It was Eric's hand-drawn map of Siam and the Burma Railway, the one he had hidden in the latrine wall at Canberra. The map showed the route of the railway, the rivers, the boundaries of Siam. Eric knew this was a capital offense. The NCO grabbed Eric by the shoulder and dragged him outside into the yard. A bench had been placed in the open. They tied him to it, face up. The interpreter stood beside him, asking questions in a flat, mechanical voice. "Why did you make the map? Were you in contact with the Chinese?" With each question, the NCO swung a thick tree branch down onto Eric's chest and stomach. Eric used his splinted arms to shield himself, and the branch smashed into the bandages. The blows kept coming. The NCO stopped hitting him and walked to a nearby tap. He came back holding a rubber hosepipe with water dribbling from its end. He pressed the nozzle to Eric's face, just inches from his nostrils and mouth, then turned the tap full on. Water poured down Eric's throat and into his lungs. He gagged and choked, unable to breathe. The sensation was drowning on dry land. When Eric was near unconsciousness, the NCO pulled the hose away. The interpreter's voice returned. "Lomax, you will tell us?" The beating and the water resumed. Eric does not remember how long the torture lasted. He clung to his story that the map was a souvenir drawn because he loved trains. He gave no names, no contacts, no confessions beyond what the Japanese already knew. Eventually, the NCO stopped. That night, he came to Eric's cage and handed through the bars a mug of hot, sweetened condensed milk. It was not kindness. It was a calculated gesture to keep a prisoner off balance. A few days later, as the prisoners were loaded onto a truck, the interpreter walked up to Eric and said gravely, "Keep your chin up." The truck took them to Ban Pong Station, then by train to Bangkok. On November 22, 1943, they stood before a Japanese court-martial in a requisitioned mansion. Presiding general wore whiskers that drooped below his chin. A prosecutor called them the most dangerous anti-Japanese group the Kempeitai had ever dealt with. The court found them guilty of being a bad influence. Lance Thu and Fred Smith each received 10 years imprisonment. Bill Smith, Jim Slater, Harry Knight, Morton Mackay, and Eric Lomax each received 5 years. Lance Thu, however, was ordered to stay behind in Bangkok, separated from the others. The other 6 were immediately handcuffed, loaded onto another train, and sent south toward Singapore. Their destination was Outram Road Jail. In November 1943, the train pulled into Singapore Station. 6 men stepped down into the afternoon heat, handcuffed and bruised, their clothes in rags. Within an hour, they stood before the gray mock-Gothic walls of Outram Road Jail. The massive doors swung open, then boomed shut behind them. All justice, all hope, all human contact ended at that threshold. Reception was a ritual of total erasure. Guards stripped them naked, inspected every orifice, issued shorts and shirts so patched and rotted they barely counted as clothing. Names were abolished. Eric became number 615. He was locked in a concrete cell 9 feet long and 6 feet wide, bare except for 3 wooden planks, a blanket, a wooden block for a pillow, and a latrine bucket. The only sound was the echo of a guard's boots on the stone floor. Silence was law. Beatings came for whispering. The months that followed were a slow drowning. Meals consisted of a bowl of overcooked rice and a dish of hot water 3 times a day. Thirst was constant. A scabies epidemic swept the block, covering every inch of skin below Eric's face in transparent pimples that burst into yellow pus and hardened into crusts. He lost every patch of skin from his shoulders to his knees. The itch was maddening. Scratching meant losing flesh. One prisoner, Signalman John O'Malley, voluntarily picked the scabs off the most helpless men and washed their raw bodies in cold water. That act of mercy was as close to a hospital as Outram Road ever came. Eric's body had wasted to little more than a skeleton. His ribs stuck out. His stomach touched his spine. He could close his hand around his own upper arm. In the exercise yard, he saw men crawling on hands and knees, others lying naked and bloated with beriberi, their faces swollen beyond recognition. Eric made a decision. He would fake a critical illness or die trying. He discovered he could drive his pulse rate up by deep, rapid breathing, forcing his heart into a pounding panic. He called for a guard, collapsed, twisted, and clutched his chest. They carried him to the ground floor 6 cells. In the 6th cell, he met an Australian private named Stan Davis, a radio man from a camp in Borneo who had watched his own officer executed by the Japanese. Together, they devised a plan. Davis would eat nothing but rice, bloating himself into a convincing case of beriberi. Eric would eat everything except rice, starving himself even thinner. For 2 months, they stuck to the diet, growing sicker by the week, exaggerating every stumble and collapse. One morning, Eric worked his pulse into a frenzy, cried out, and went rigid. The guards, not wanting a death on their hands, loaded him onto a stretcher and drove him out the gates. He opened his eyes to see the open sky, heard Chinese voices, smelled the city. He was inside Changi Hospital, among friends who wept to see him. The respite lasted only a few weeks. On January 25, 1945, a Japanese medical officer walked into the ward, examined Eric, and judged him fit for Outram Road. Back he went to the concrete cell, the silence, the starvation. This time he planned a different escape. For days he studied the iron staircase at the end of D Block, counting the steps, memorizing the open backs. He arranged to carry the latrine buckets up to the 1st floor. On the 17th step, he shoved his left leg through the open back of the stair and pulled the stretcher and empty buckets down on top of himself. The crash of wood and metal echoed through the silent hall. He lay at the bottom in a heap, feigning paralysis, roaring with pain he did not have to fake. For 2 weeks he lay motionless on his planks, refusing food, refusing to move, letting his body grow filthy and weak. He urinated where he lay. The guards poked him, prodded him, brought a medical orderly who jabbed a long needle into his gum to test his reaction. Eric did not flinch. At last they believed him. A stretcher party carried him out of Outram Road for the last time. On April 10, 1945, he heard a Scottish voice say, "It's Lomax again," and knew he was back in Changi. Germany would surrender a month later on May 8th, but in Changi no one knew when the war would end. The Pacific War was still grinding on. Then, on August 15th, Japan surrendered. 4 days after Japan surrendered, the gates of Outram Road were opened from the inside. The survivors walked out, 1 or 2 dying within hours of reaching Changi. Fred Smith appeared, still upright after 22 continuous months inside that tomb. Morton Mackay and Jim Slater stumbled out, gaunt but alive. Eric sat down at a typewriter and began to compile lists of every prisoner who had passed through the military section of Outram Road. He typed on scraps of Red Cross Only One toilet tissue paper, the thin brown sheets fraying under the keys. The words were faint, the ribbon worn, but the record held. Eric Lomax survived the war and returned to Britain. His body mended, but his mind sealed around the memories he could not yet touch. Fred Smith went home to his family in London. Bill Smith also survived, returning to Britain a broken but living man. Morton Mackay returned to Scotland. Jim Slater signed the official complaint about the Canberra beatings and carried his bitterness into civilian life. Lance Thew, the radio builder, vanished from Eric's sight after Outram Road. He survived the war. Harry Knight, however, died at Changi within weeks of being brought there, his body too worn down to recover. Stan Davis, the Australian private who had starved himself alongside Eric, was eventually evacuated from Outram Road and survived the war. Jack Hawley and Stanley Armitage, beaten to death at Canberra, were dumped in a Japanese latrine and did not survive the war. The young Japanese interpreter who had told Eric to keep his chin up faded into the chaos of defeat, his name unknown, his face forgotten, his one sentence of kindness the only trace he left behind. If you have any personal stories, family memories, or historical anecdotes from this era, from the camps, the railway, or the fall of Singapore, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments below. We read each one. And if you would like to support more documentaries like this one, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.